Hey there, and welcome to this video podcast. It's a joint production between GoClassics magazine and Brown Car Guy. Now, to electrify or not to electrify, that is the question that we'll be tackling today. And with the two guests I have for you, sparks might actually fly. I'm Shazad Sheikh, aka the Brown Car Guy, and as well as being a motoring journalist and content creator for over 3 decades, I'm also the media editor and a columnist at GoClassics. And if you haven't seen it yet, issue 4 of the magazine is out. It's brilliant. It's packed full of features, buying guides, tons of advice, and of course, you don't want to miss my column, which is right. If I can find it, it's right there. It's right there. If you're going to get the magazine for nothing else, get it for my column. Actually, that's one of our guest column. That one there.
That's a good column.
That's there's a voice from out of nowhere. That's Simeon's column, and then of course my column is nearer the beginning. There you go, and it's all about resto mods, which might actually be relevant to today's conversation. So anyway, pick up your copy at goclassics.co.uk. You can get it in print or digital form. So this then is the big debate: should you convert classic cars to electric? Well, in the blue corner, we have Steve Drummond, who's the founder of Electrogenics, and transitioning from the nuclear industry in his early days, he's a pioneer of renewable energy and actively involved in sustainability initiatives and climate change awareness. Now, as a mechanical engineer, when he was arm twisted into buying a 1967 VW Samba, ever the engineer's eco warrior, his first thought was to convert it to electric, and that sort of brought him to where he is today. Now, over in the red corner, and possibly seeing red at the sacrileges we're about to delve into, is Simeon Cattle. Now, he's a columnist also on GoClassics. I just showed you his column, and it's brilliantly called The Cattle Market. But he's also the founder of the Classic Project Shop. And in this venture alone, over the last 10 years, he has worked on nearly 2,000 cars and restored over 45 classics, including many E-Types and 911s. Hello, gentlemen. How are we doing today? Have you guys met before?
We know each other just because of our locality. Steve has his business just up at Bicester Heritage. We're just outside the gate, so we've met at some of the previous coffee meetings and bits and pieces.
And Steve, you and I spent quite a bit of time at the British Motor Show, didn't we?
Yeah, we did. We had a lot of fun preaching to the almost converted about electric cars and the joys and the sometimes pitfalls of them.
How did you find that show? Did it go well for you overall over the 4 days?
I enjoyed it. I fell in love with a Citroen Big Six, which is a petrol car. Unfortunately, but no, it was really interesting. It was a lot of fun, and I think that we could have. Yeah, I think that next time we should make a lot more of the electric side of things, and I think this is something that will naturally happen as we're rocketing towards 2030 anyway.
I think so. I think they are planning to up the scale when it comes to EVs at the British Motor Show. In fact, those people watching, if you head over to the Brown Car Guy channel, I've just put up a full preview of next year's 2022 British Motor Show. Everything has been announced, and it's also been confirmed that I'm going to be back again at the Tech Theatre hosting that. So I'll probably see you there, Steve. So listen, guys, I want a good, clean fight. Nothing below the belt, and let's see if we can take this the distance. So, Steve, first up, let's elaborate a little bit on your journey from Homer Simpson to Elon Musk via Greta Thunberg.
Yeah. So I started off in Springfield. I actually have been to Springfield, Missouri. That's a whole other story. Yeah. I started off in the nuclear industry. I proved very early on that a certain nuclear power station would potentially have a catastrophic loss of coolant if they didn't change the design. But that design was changed, so that's all cool. That's a very long time ago. Yeah, indeed. I've been. I'm an engineer from the power industry. I also then. So I've built a lot of power stations. I moved into finance. I financed a lot of power stations, been doing renewable energy exclusively for the last 20 years or so. But I was busy trying to build a biomass power plant in the middle of a hurricane in Cuba when an old friend of mine was trying to talk me into buying another Samba. And I was like, oh, no, but the engine's crap. And he was saying, well, you should make it electric. And I was saying, well, that's a ridiculous idea. They're rubbish, So, but I didn't have anything else to do. So I got bored of taking the Michael, and actually did some research and went off to San Diego to worship at the altar of EV West, the sort of granddaddy of all of this, and went for a drive in their old VW bus, and I was converted. And so then, we thought we'd bring the love to the UK and share it around a bit and show everybody how amazing this is. How you can not just turn something from petrol to electric, that's a hygiene factor, if you like. That's something, it has to be environmental, otherwise don't do it. But it's all about making beautiful old cars fun and lively and exciting again, and keeping up with modern traffic, and a pleasure to drive. And that's what we do at Electrogenic.
So before we go to Simeon, so this sounds relative. When was that when you had that that experience of trying that classic electric car?
It was sort of 4 or 5 years ago, something like that.
So you're a relatively recent convert, and so initially you yourself were a little bit like, "Ooh, I'm not sure I want to do that."
Yeah, to be honest, it's mostly because I've never really focused on cars as being a very important part of my life. I focus a lot on motorbikes, and heavily into. I'm really into the engineering and the beauty and simplicity of new engineering concepts and applying them. And so, actually, although I've always had old cars, and because of just the smile it brings to your face, I've had a lot of old buses, for example, and you go from beach to beach down in Cornwall, and it's just the most beautiful thing, and you're grinning all the way, and it's great. As long as you've done all the mechanics to make sure it doesn't break down, it does get up those 2-in-1 hills. But really, what happened when I went to San Diego was I realized that for the very first time, the technology was available to people like you and me to make it possible to make an electric car that was worth owning. And I think that's the important thing. And so that's why I got excited. I got excited about bringing the beauty of the new technology, the new clean tech, to some beautiful old vehicles. And it's the melding of those two things that got me excited.
So, Simeon, what do you reckon? Is it sacrilege? He was converted to do this after he actually drove a car. Do you think that this is a bad thing?
Well, I think it's not a terrible thing. You've
changed your tune.
There are many positive points, but I think the one of the big points is that classic cars, by the time they've reached the age they are, 30, 40 odd years of age, they've paid their carbon dues, and they are not an everyday piece of transport. So, it's all well and good to build retro mods, whether they be powered by a different engine or electricity. But they old cars are a piece of our history, and they deserve to be left intact.
So, Steve, old cars have paid their dues, so do not need to be converted to electric.
Well, emissions are emissions. They still make smelly stuff that comes out of the back end of them, and a lot more smelly stuff than a modern petrol car. But really, more to the point, what we're about is making cars that you want to drive, and that means that you're sort of typical classic car owner he's got his family car, and then there's the little car for doing running around and local journeys, and then there's the ornament that sits in the garage, bounce the other cars to the driveway, and gets used twice a year for going for a run in the Cotswolds or whatever, and then you're worrying about whether you're going to get home again. It turns that car into a reliable daily driver. And then you can throw away your Nissan Micra, not replace it with a new electric car, and avoid the construction of a whole new car. And that's, if you want to look at the environmental side of things, that's really where it wins out. You're taking something which, you're right, has paid its carbon dues, but you're making it into something that replaces the construction of a whole new vehicle now. And that's the exciting part of it.
So,
Yeah.
Simeon, it's an interesting point, and it's a point that actually was made to me recently by somebody else as well. That, if you're looking to replace half of the car park in the UK, we're talking 40 plus million vehicles. And you're going to produce 20 million vehicles, for example, to replace it. I mean, you yourself, as we were talking earlier about the carbon footprint of producing a brand new car, as opposed to taking an existing car and then just converting it. Surely that's not a bad idea.
Yes, it's not a bad idea. It's really difficult to understand the maths on all of this. Volvo have just brought out some information that's published on their Polestar website, where they suggest that the difference between producing an XC40 as a pure petrol car and their electric car is 10 tons of carbon. So if you are if you say that the battery packs that you are then putting in an old car, which is now at zero because it's paid its dues, it's got to do 10,000 tons worth of driving before it gets back to net zero again. So there is the whole thing about tailpipe exhaust gases, but I think that's easily offset by damage to the environment in taking lithium out of the ground. So I think you just end up trading all the time. So I think to sit down and say that there are green credentials for it, there are, as long as that car then goes out and does 6, 8, 10, 12,000 miles a year. But the reality of the classic car park, it does a very small amount of mileage, and it's there for historic purposes. So we're not talking about taking say a 12-year-old Fiesta and putting an electric motor in. We're talking about taking apart a piece of what's now history, part of the very few survivors that are left, and basically changing what amounts to 25% of it to run on something else.
So, Steve, what Simeon is saying is it's very little impact. The cars aren't used very much. But however, from the vibe that I'm getting from you, surely you're suggesting that actually by converting converting the classic car to electric, you're actually making them more usable. A point again that was actually in a recent video, you guys probably know them, is London Electric Cars, and had a conversation there with Matthew Quitter. And one of the things he was saying was that in the morning you get into a classic car, you have to put the choke on, you have to warm it up, you don't know if it's going to start, etc., etc. But once you've converted to classic, that's never an issue. As long as it's charged, off it goes.
Yeah, well, that's right. I think there are a lot of statistics that you can quote. And I think Simeon was comparing the difference between making a new electric car and a new petrol car. And of course, what we're doing is neither of those.
Well, no, what I was saying was that the net difference between the battery pack. So if you're putting a brand new battery pack into a classic car, then all of a sudden it has 10,000 tons of carbon to use up.
Okay, so I mean, you have inspired me to do a blog, do some research, and do a blog on the entrained emissions in a battery pack, and where they arise and how they can be dealt with. So I will do that. I promise. In my spare time at New Year or something. I don't know. Shazad, your point was that it makes an old car usable, and that's our point too. It changes your third car, which you use occasionally, into your second car, and so you do use a lot more, and you use a lot more because it's fun. If you can drive around in a Nissan Leaf, or you can drive around in a classic Beetle that's been converted to all electric. And in 5 years' time, your classic Beetle is still worth the same amount of money. Your Nissan Leaf has depreciated to nothing. And you've had 5 years of driving around with a big grin on your face instead of, just a look of boredom and wondering what's for your dinner. So, as you would expect, what I'm doing passionately is building cars that people want to drive. And so I'm enthusiastic about that.
So just to pick up on that point, and also what Simeon said, I think that's fantastic. Now, the idea of the cars being reusable. Now, I should just mention before we get into this is that I know that I think you use brand new battery packs, but a lot of people doing conversions are actually using existing Tesla or Nissan Leaf packs, motors and battery packs, either from cars that have been salvaged or whatever, or they've just been, the Nissan Leafs, for example, are now so cheap used you could just buy them and reuse the battery packs. But you're talking about new battery packs. Now, what about the impact that the production of those batteries is having? And you mentioned earlier mining lithium from the ground. And last year there were a lot of horror stories about the impact that that's having, A, on the human cost of it in terms of labor and how people are going about it, and B, on the environment itself. Is this still an issue, or have we started to address this?
Yeah, you need to source your raw materials responsibly, just like you do with iron ore, and just like you do with petroleum extraction, and just like you do with all of it, really. There's a big thing in the media very recently about rare earth metals being used in lithium battery packs, and how that was going to use up the world resources, when the fact is that to refine petroleum takes 5 times more of those same rare earth metals. So when you're buying anything, be it battery packs or clothing or petroleum, buying it from an ethically sourced, ethical source, of course, is important. In trained energy in doing that, I am going to do the research, as I just promised Simeon. But as it has happened in the clothing market, as the lens of sort of public opinion gets focused much more on production of electric cars and how these things are done, then these problems are being ironed out. And so, as with anything, sunlight is the best disinfectant. And so making sure that things are produced ethically is, of course, important.
So, Simeon, in light of what Steve is saying, also against the backdrop, as we are recording this, of obviously COP26 that's going on in Glasgow, and obviously there's a lot of interest, especially from the younger generation, in going to renewable sources, going to cleaner cars and cleaner emissions, and also the talk that we had earlier about the fact that if you have a classic car, will it start? Will it go? Is it smelly? Is it putting out emissions? Are there petrol fumes? In an electric car, you just press the button and off you glide.
Yeah. So I think going back to sort of COP26, I've actually come from a background of looking at climate change really since I was born. My father was a meteorologist. And was assistant director at the Hadley Centre for Climate Research and Prediction when I was just in single digits. So I've sort of been brought up around all of these arguments. So there's nothing new to that to me. I think the point with anything is that we've got to have a look at what we consume. That's the biggest area that we as individuals can make. So if we swapped our car changing cycle from 2 to 8 years, we could wipe over 100,000 tons of carbon out of our 8-year cycle. So that's the sort of thing you can do. In terms of old cars, you're absolutely right. If you get rid of the engine and put a motor in, they are intrinsically more reliable and they require less work to keep them in that state. I think the thing that you have to realise here is that old cars do require a lot of maintenance, and that's where people get this idea of old cars being unreliable, smelly, dirty, comes from. Yes, they're not as advanced as modern vehicles in terms of their emissions and running systems and all the rest of it. But actually, a well-maintained classic car can be, perfectly reliable. We have literally 100 customers that probably do 6 to 12,000 miles a year in various historic rallies, events, trips abroad. Some use them as a second to third car. But the majority of classic cars are, that they will always be, whether they have an electric power plant in them or not, they're not as safe for putting your children inside, for example, as a modern car. So they're always going to be used sparingly. So although I think the technology is fantastic, the engineering inside it's a great thing to get your head around and apply it. Wouldn't it be better put to use in proper everyday transport for people to have proper green transport from their homes to
I mean that's definitely happening. I mean, the number of electric brand new cars that I've reviewed, this year alone, I don't think I've ever driven that many in the entire previous 30 years, But just picking up on that point, Steve, one of the things you mentioned is that you were converted when you actually went and drove an electric car. So, I mean, how different is it? I mean, does it fundamentally change the character of the car?
It depends how you do the conversion, but I would like to pick up on Simeon's point, because I think the counterfactual to that is just to look at our customer base. Our customer base encompasses all sorts of people, whole age groups, but there are three big groups really. One is people who are in their 50s, 60s, they've owned a classic car for a long time, don't want to be doing the maintenance anymore. The parts for the engines are getting trickier to source. They're becoming temperamental. They are they're early adopters. They're interested in the environment and they want to convert because they want it to be clean and they don't want to do the maintenance anymore. And these are people that drive their car every day. And then our next biggest group is young professionals, 30s, 40s. They've always liked the idea of having a classic car. They think they're beautiful. A lot of them live in London, where they can see the emissions regulations ever tightening, and they're concerned about that, particularly if the car isn't so classic that it's still exempted. But they don't know, they'd like to have a classic car, but they don't have the wherewithal, the time or the capability to maintain it. So then they think, I could make it electric. So then they go and buy a classic car in order to convert and drive every day. And then our third biggest customer group are farmers who, 36,000 farms have renewable energy generation on site on their farms right now. They are all using smelly old diesel Defenders, which consume a lot of diesel. The statistics we have, 6,000 pounds worth of diesel a year for your typical Land Rover being used on a farm. They can convert those to electricity and drive around on cheap, virtually free electricity because they're making it themselves. So all of our big three customer groups are all using their vehicles every day. In terms of the driving experience, well, it depends how you convert it. So actually, sort of 9 out of 10 classic owners that we convert cars for keep the gearbox because they want to have that active driving experience. They want to shift down in the corners and accelerate around the curve and all of that. And so what you find is that, so we have a Porsche 356 downstairs, which, for example, it's the only real one that's been converted as far as we know in the world, and it's
this is a genuine,
real one, of course, real cars.
Oh wow!
But so I drove it before.
I'm just gonna come back to you on that one because go on, finish your point.
So when it came in, it had actually just had its engine rebuilt. It had done 400 miles on the rebuilt engine. And I drove it. And it's a nice car, but it's very fussy in the gears. It's quite an acquired taste. Not so simple to drive. When you've converted it, it's still got all the gears. You still actually need to use them in order to drive it sort of, not aggressively, but, actively, if you like. But because you've got the wider torque band, it's much more relaxed. It's fun. It's also quick. We had it was driven by a chap at Bicester Heritage, one of our neighbours at Bicester Heritage too, who has a fully race prep Porsche 356 with big carburetors and all of that, and our electric conversion is faster. And
Wow.
it's just a joy to drive. I've driven it a lot of country miles between shows and so on, and it's just lovely. And after we delivered it to the customer, he sent me a little video of his wife driving it and saying, "Wow, this is the first one of your cars I've ever actually enjoyed driving. You should convert all of them to electric."
That's amazing. I haven't actually driven an electric
Well, you
car
should
yet,
come
so
here
that'll
and
be.
drive one, and I hope you're going to do that in a couple of weeks. Yeah.
I think I might do that.
Okay.
So, Simeon, Steve has just converted an actual Porsche 356. How do you feel about that? I just want to read before we get into that. Obviously, I've been doing a fair bit of content on classic cars, and a good journalist friend of mine commented on one of my posts, and he said, "You might as well put them in the crusher and recycle the parts if they're doing it for sustainability reasons. It's killed their historical significance and ultimately the value. And for a minimal amount of miles that people do in their classic cars, it's negligible or perhaps even worse for the environment when you take in the energy that's used." Well, I mean, we've already covered that, the electric motor and et cetera, et cetera. Does that echo your own feelings then, Simeon?
Yeah, I mean, my big point is that the engine is a fundamental part of a car, and I realise that I am part of a dying group of people. But that
Steve just nodded his head there vigorously.
because but that doesn't mean that that they shouldn't be preserved in the state in which they were originally conceived. The thing about a Porsche 356 and a well-sorted one that drives beautifully, the vibration that comes from the engine, the noise, the sound, it's all part of the experience. And I get the fact that people who aren't car people like the look of old cars and want to drive them but don't want to have the hassle of owning them. But guess what? If you went and bought yourself a grade 2 listed house and you just banged UPVC windows in it, somebody would have something to say about it. And I think, for cars that are in really short supply now, I don't think it's too far a stretch to say that's essentially what you're doing to
Yeah, but so Simeon, what you're really saying is we should consign all of the classic cars to the crusher, because when people like you do die out, who's going to maintain them? Who's going to own them? How are they going to stay on the road? You're going to put them. My first ever job was at Bewley Motor Museum, right? And that's a beautiful, amazing, wonderful place because they have classic cars and they maintain them because they have a fleet of professionals doing that every day and they drive them. Fantastic. But the rest of us don't have those facilities. So what's going to happen to all these cars that don't work?
Well, the thing is that, heritage engineering skills, as you well know, because you've got apprentices in there who are sort of doing a hybrid side of it. They're doing the new bit and the old bit. But all we're really talking about is the running of the engine here. Actually, maintaining a classic car is way more complicated than that. Body restoration, the electrics that run inside the car just to power its normal lights and other bits and pieces, all the bushing, suspension, that sort of thing. So anybody who's going to learn those skills is also going to learn about the skills of keeping a petrol engine running. And there will always be specialist companies that do that, just in the same way that there are specialist companies who are involved in keeping steam engines and all of that sort of thing on the road. My point is that these things are part of history. They, if you and by and large, they should be left as such. if you want to use the thing about using classic cars every day is that, frankly, they're not very safe to drive. They have no airbags, no anti-lock brakes. The suspension is relatively archaic. Steering is relatively archaic. And they were designed very much to be part of their parameter. So a Volkswagen Beetle was designed to have about 30 horsepower in it. So if you then put even one of the lower powered battery and electric motor units, all of a sudden they've got 100 horsepower. So it's my point is that just because it goes better doesn't mean it stops, goes round corners, or when you hit something, deforms in the same way that a modern Nissan Leaf would do.
So what you're arguing
Can I come in
is
on
that
this?
people
Because
should never drive their classic cars ever, because you can't say.
Yeah, so let me come in on this, Steve, because it's interesting, because I'm really torn at the moment, because I started off a few months ago as a complete EV skeptic, and then of course I spent a lot of time with you, Steve, at the motor show, and with quite a few experts, and recently I went to, like I said, I went to see London electric cars. Now the thing about these cars is that I still struggle with. So, for example, I know I very early on, I think it was last year, I saw a company had converted a Ferrari 308 to electric. And to me, that was like, oh my God, but it's a Ferrari and that's the engine. And how could you do that? But then I look at my own, most favorite car. And I don't know if people can see the shelf behind me, but it's full of Lotus Esprits, And when I think back to the original, say the S1 or the S2 Esprit, the original Esprit, now Lotus, when they conceived of the Esprit, it was meant to have a V8. But because of the whole fuel crisis and everything, it never actually got a V8. It got a four-cylinder engine. It got I love the Esprit, but let's be honest, it's got pretty crappy gearbox and clutch and everything in it. So suddenly I start to think that, well, the reason I love the Esprit, and I'm not a DIY enthusiast at all. I don't like tinkering with engines or mechanics or anything at all. But the reason I love it is because of the shape and because of the fundamentals of how it handles. So all of a sudden I'm thinking, well, what if it was converted to electric? Because it could be better. And recently I had this conversation where somebody was converting an old Bentley to electric. And it was like, well, why would you do that? There was two reasons. A, because they don't use it very much. And where they use it in central London, you don't have to go very far and you don't have to go very fast. But more importantly, his daughters refused to get into the car because it's a big, ugly, smelly combustion engine car. But he wanted to share his love and passion for that car with his family. And by converting it to electric, he's finding a level of acceptance for that vehicle that he wouldn't have had otherwise.
Yeah. And when you come and see us, you can see a Lotus Elite being converted just the same. It's a similar thing. But probably my favorite conversion. People ask me, "What's your favorite conversion?" And the answer is it's always the latest one, because we always put something new in. It's really exciting. But the one I was really, really, really in love with was a Citroen DS. So we did a beautiful conversion, including repowering all of the hydrogen pneumatic suspension, all of that tech. Great, I love all that stuff. But nobody ever bought the DS because of the engine in the first place, and it was just destined to be electric. You can see that by looking at it, and it drives beautifully now. And so why wouldn't you do that? Why people put Mazda engines in TR6s, and people do all sorts of things with cars, just because instead of putting a bigger petrol engine in, you make it electric. I don't see how that's really any different, or how it's more sacrilegious. People have been modifying cars since cars were invented, and this is just another thing on the same continuum.
So, Simeon, you've worked on 2,000 cars over your time at the Classic Project Shop. Would you be comfortable working on an electric classic car that rolled into your shop? Because there's going to be more and more of them out there now, aren't there?
Yeah, it looks that way. I think actually it's one of those things that you have to do a really serious check through your own sort of health and safety with. Certainly, if you're going to work on modern EVs, there's all sorts of extra equipment that you need to make sure that your guys are safe working on them. I mean, these big DC batteries, they give you one hell of a jolt, and it hurts while it kills you. There's no doubt about it that if we're
Steve said, how would you know?
Anecdotally, but DC big. There's a reason why we don't have DC current in the walls of our house, for example. You know, it's a nasty thing if you get zapped by it. So you know, there's no doubt about it. If electric cars become part of the classic car movement, and it's the sort of thing that we're going to get involved in looking after, then we will need to properly train our staff. We'll need to have defibrillators on site just in case. You know, and you also need proper insulating apparatus before you start getting involved in looking at the battery pack.
So, Steve, how dangerous are these cars to work on? And also, to a previous point as well, which Simeon made about the safety aspects of the car, putting aside the crash safety aspect of it, because obviously that is that's a structural thing. But in terms of like a resto mod, if you're restoring a car, if you're changing the electronics or you're changing the drivetrain of the car, then you could change the brakes, you could put power steering in, you could put you could put ABS in, you could put ESP in, you could do all that.
Absolutely. I mean, I've never met an E-Type that hasn't been modified ever. You know, the people put air conditioning in, they change the brakes, they change all sorts of aspects of the car because they want to make it actually nicer to drive. What we're doing is very similar. For a company like us, so we are doing the fundamental engineering, you know, so basically what we do is we buy in the motors and the batteries, and all the rest of the engineering is our own. So all of the drivetrains, all of the electronics, you know, charging systems, battery management systems, vehicle management systems, everything that drives all the original gauges, so it still looks the same on the dashboard, and you repurpose your fuel gauge to show your state of charge, and all of those things. This is all our own engineering, and including building up, designing, and then building up the battery packs. And so, of course, in a business like ours, you need all of the normal health and safety and safeguards and proper training and so on. Of course, we do all of that. If you're working on the car as a third party, once we've made it, it's a different kettle of fish. If you have an accident or turn the 12 volts off, then the battery packs are completely sealed and there's no electricity coming out of them. So you can work on, unless you put a power drill through the battery, then you can work on the car perfectly safely. So there's a lot of safety features that we build into the car to ensure that your mechanic that comes to deal with the car and wants to deal with aspects of it which are not to do with either penetrating the battery pack or, you know, as long as they have the wit to turn the car off before they start poking around in high voltage cables, then they're perfectly safe.
Simeon, how do you feel about working on the cars now in light of what Steve has said?
As I say, again, it's about it's all about knowing what you should and shouldn't be doing, isn't it? And being educated. And I think one of my worries is that we are very early on in this. You're absolutely right. We've been modifying cars for hundreds of years. Well, for 100 years anyway. You know, every car that we have that comes into the workshop has one or two thing or more that's different. But we're very much modifying within the technology we've got. What we're actually doing here is shoehorning something that's very specifically designed for a modern scenario into an old structure that moves at up to 100 miles an hour down the road. So in terms of getting things, and it is lovely to hear that Steve's company, you know, they're so enthralled by the engineering exercise. I just worry that that actually they're at the pinnacle end of the spectrum, and although you know, we have lots of standards throughout the car world, actually resto modding things like electric drivetrains into cars isn't one of them, and especially actually as now a lot of the older cars are MOT exempt. So again, I go back to my previous situation. You have a and this isn't part of Steve's business, I know, because they restore the vehicles. But you have a car like a Beetle designed for 38 horsepower. You pop your electric motor in, it's now got 100 horsepower, but it's still fundamentally got the same brakes. It now weighs significantly more because of the battery packs. The weight necessarily isn't in the most ideal place, because you've got to put it where it has space rather than necessarily where it would sit if you designed it from the ground up. So, you know, these cars don't need to be checked. They can go out with 3 times the amount of horsepower that they originally started with. And that's a problem across the classic car world, because I could just dump a V8 in the front of a thing. But fundamentally, we give massive instant torque and big power upgrades without there being any check to make sure they can stop, go round corners, that the handling of the car isn't, really wayward. I've never driven one of Steve's cars, but I did drive a Tesla-powered split screen that was, much more of a homebrew scenario. The guy had come in actually because the front suspension had collapsed just when he was coming up to one of the Bicester scrambles, and we put the front suspension together. But drum brakes and 400 odd horsepower just seemed utterly mental to me. So that's where I think we really need, we need to start looking at some sort of either self-regulating industry standard where we as professionals say, if you're going to do this, you need to do this, this, and this to make this a safe and viable thing for the road.
I wonder if we've gone too early with this whole thing, because obviously one of the things you just said, you were converting an Elite, and obviously the thing about Lotus is, what did it say? Add, make it as light as possible, and then add lightness. It's all about lightness with Lotus, but you're adding a battery pack which is inherently heavy. But obviously this technology is advancing very quickly, and batteries are getting more and more efficient. Do you think we've gone too early with converting classic cars to electric? Surely down the line we'll get more compact and lighter units?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, on the whole sort of regulation thing, I've never been big on spending time telling other people what to do. So we run our business. We're very focused on not only safety but about making drivable cars. All our cars are MOT'd, because if you modify a car, you have to have it MOT'd. They're still tax exempt, but they are MOT'd. And we're sort of getting on with it. And there are so many rules and regulations and laws about health and safety, and there are guidelines from British Motorsport which we follow in the most part, and so on and so on. And so yes, I can see where Simeon's coming from, but also, I like, the great British tradition of being able to modify cars. If you go to Germany, you can't modify a car at all. You have to let BMW, Audi, and Volkswagen do that for you. I mean, it's a sort of a nightmare. If you go to France, you can convert a car, but as long as it doesn't go faster than the original. So, which is great if you're converting a little 2CV to go down to the shops, but it's not. It's not fundamentally that interesting. And the reason for that is not because you necessarily want to make something go crazy fast. I would never put a Tesla motor in a split screen, for example. That's slightly insane. But it's because you want to make it drivable in modern traffic. If you do drive an old Beetle and you maintain the engine so it's pretty reliable, what you find is that you can't pull out of T-junctions because you need a big gap and everybody's traveling too fast. You can't go down the slip road onto the ring road because, with luck and a following wind, by the time you get to the bottom of the slip road, you're doing 45 and everybody on the ring road's doing 70. And so they're scary and dangerous to drive in modern traffic. And so what we're doing is we're updating them so that they are safer in the sense that they go at the same speed as the rest of the traffic. And if you want to stop in time, number one, you've got regen braking, but number two, put discs on. It's not a big deal. So what we're about is...
And in terms of how the technology is developing, in terms of how the technology is developing, the whole discussion of,
in terms of how the technology is developing, what we see is a few different things. As I say, all of the tech that holds the car together is all our own, and we did that because we couldn't buy what we wanted. And that's then a strength for the company because it means we can make the car do what we want. So we're in control, and that enables us to introduce these safety features and also extras that the customers like. The thing that has been very difficult to get hold of for a while is a range of motors to be able to sort of satisfy the range of sort of power requirements of different cars. As I think mentioned earlier, you can take second-hand motors out of crashed EVs. We tend not to do that. We don't really like doing it because, and the reason is very simple, is that if you buy a new motor, you get all of the control architecture and software from the manufacturer. If you take a car out of a crashed Tesla or Nissan, you don't. So you're either then going for hacks for the internet, or you're replacing the ECU with a third-party clone. So it's very difficult, if not impossible, to actually to provide guarantees to our customers, apart from the sort of wider issues. What we're seeing now, though, is because there haven't been very many motors around, because nobody thought of making electric cars really en masse until in the VW diesel crisis. So, but more are coming through now. So on our tech development curve, I can tell you over the next 18 months, there's some really interesting motors coming through. On the batteries, what you tend to find is that they're not coming down in price, but what they are doing is more miles for the volume and weight. So the price per kilowatt hour is pretty constant, but the number of kilowatt hours you can get into a car for a given size of battery is increasing. So, but in any case, I mean, you made some assumptions in the various comments you made about it makes the car heavier and so on and so on. I mean, our E-Type is actually 100 kilos lighter than the original and drives like a dream. The Beetle, for example, is about 80 kilos heavier. Much of that's in the front. So what we've done is we've taken out the sack of cement that used to be in there in order to keep the front on the road in the old guys, and put some batteries in there in front. We make sure that the batteries are distributed through the car so that the balance is actually often better than the original. So, again, it's about the engineering. Did we start too early? No, because what are we supposed to do? Wait until the big OEMs have done so much catch up that there's some products that they may deem to drop into into the wider market. I think we might be waiting for a very long time if we're going to do that. So now's the time. It's a great renaissance opportunity for British motor trade, for small one-offs, for small volume manufacturers, for car restorers, for all sorts of people. It's a whole brave new world, and that's one of the exciting things about it.
Wow, you know what? I'm really getting convinced by this, and I'm looking forward to coming up and meeting you and driving one of your cars. I think that might really seal the deal for me. But in terms of what you said, it is sounding more convincing. I still have an issue with taking rarefied cars and something that is exclusive. For example, I know a company is converting Aston Martin DB5s and DB6s, and I'm like, oh, I don't know about that. But there are a lot of everyday cars that can be converted and used every day. And I think that, there is definitely a future for that. Now, I was hoping that this was going to be a knockout punch at the end of, okay, so I thought that Simeon had actually left because I thought he had decided that he was not going to win this fight, but he's back. And I think I'm going to give him 1 minute, literally 1 minute to initiate a counter blow before he goes away. And is this the last gasp of the internal combustion engine?
I hope not, no. I think what electric cars are a really interesting engineering exercise. I think that they are a cool hot rod of a modern car, or of a classic car, but ultimately I think they're just a curiosity for a smaller amount of people. I think what we really need to focus on is the fact that these old things need preserving. They're not doing too much damage to the environment, and there are loads of other ways in which we can bring down our carbon footprint rather than changing a classic car to electric. But let's all go and have a drive-in one in a couple of weeks and see perhaps whether Steve can change my mind.
Okay.
There you go. It might just happen. All right, gentlemen. Thanks. I'm glad that this stayed clean. There's no blood on the floor. It's all it's all good. We're all buddies. We're all even friends. And you know what? We might be getting into electric cars. You never know. Thanks so much, gentlemen, for joining. And hope you guys enjoyed this review, this podcast. And we'll catch you all again very, very soon.
Take care.
So you want something sleek and glamorous, and then check out the Jaguar E-Type featured in our launch issue, alongside many other features such as
buying guides, owner's tips, and even how to buy your own first classic car.
GoClassics is about the cars that you relate to, the cars that you've dreamed of, and the cars that you can own, run, and enjoy. At GoClassics, we'll tell you how.
GoClassics is the most exciting car magazine on the shelves today, and it's out now. And you can get one by heading over to goclassics.co.uk, where you can find some of our fantastic limited time subscription offers.
forget about the boring, the pompous, the self-important. If you want something new,
GoClassics!